is hails from Michigan, where she did her undergraduate, and then she went on to Appalachian State for her master's degree. And for her master's degree, she looked at the effect of climbing on cliff-dwelling lichen. And so she ended up doing quite a bit of work vertically rather than horizontally in her master's degree, with her hanging from ropes off of cliffs. And when she then came to U of I, her climbing really corresponds to just climbing over sagebrush rather than climbing up and down rocks these days. But when I was first talking with Georgia about the possibility of coming here, I was explaining that she'd be working at the Rinker Rock Creek Ranch and explain the more primitive conditions there. And so as I got done describing those conditions, her response was, "Oh, you mean glamping?" So from that, I figured that she was going to do just fine. So Georgia's in an interesting position, and she is co-advised by myself and also Ava Strand, who is also joining us today. And Ava is in College of Natural Resources. Georgia's project involves looking at removal of annual grasses, how that affects plant communities, and then also how it affects fire risk, and there will be a fire modeling component as well. For today, she'll be talking about a part of her research, and but not the full extent of it. She's in her second year now, and she'll have one more field season. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Georgia.
Sam. All right, so I am excited to share with you all some preliminary results from my project related to sagebrush plant community response to an application of a herbicide in DAS plan. So first off, I wanted to provide some context for my research within broader questions of ecosystem resiliency to invasion. So some of those questions could be, why are some ecosystems more or less resilient to invasion? And what attributes make those ecosystems more or less able to be invaded? So ecosystem resiliency is the ability for an ecosystem to maintain structure and function following some sort of alteration. That could be a large flooding event, it could be an invasion of a plant in the case of my study, or it could be a wildfire or other catastrophic events. Ecosystem resiliency is classified based on two characteristics, which are its resistance, which is the ecosystem's ability to retain structure and function in the face of some disturbance or alteration. And this, the definition for what the ecosystem desired structure and function could be open to interpretation based on the current state of the ecosystem or the management goals for the area. It's also based on an ecosystem stability, which is the ability for that ecosystem to maintain its successional trajectory throughout time. So the ecosystem will move in a systematic way that we would expect it to follow, regardless of this alteration or disturbance. It's important to note that ecosystem resiliency can be both helpful or unhelpful depending on the current state of the ecosystem. So for example, we have a heavily degraded and compromised ecosystem that's already heavily invaded. It can be really challenging to shift out to a more desirable plant community once it's already so degraded. So I work in sagebrush plant communities, like Tim mentioned, and sagebrush plant communities follow a reliable continuum based on the dominant sagebrush species that is present. And this continuum is based on climate, soil moisture, can be soil texture, also elevation and overall productivity. And it's a pretty clear transition from the hotter, drier areas, which are dominated by Wyoming big sagebrush, to the mountain big sage, which are usually higher elevation, moister areas that are higher productivity. This continuum also applies to the level of ecosystem resiliency for these plant communities. So Wyoming big sagebrush is the lowest resiliency to invasion, and mountain big sage is the highest resilience to invasion. And this invasion is based off of numerous attributes, but two of them are the ability for the native plant community that is present to fight off invasion, and also the amount of space available for an invasive plant to come in and take over. So my study focuses on controlling annual grasses in the sagebrush steppe. Annual grasses are a large issue, both economically and personally, for a lot of people working and living in the sagebrush. There are over 6.8 million hectares dominated by either cheatgrass or another invasive winter annual grass. And that means that this system has transitioned to cheatgrass being the dominant cover type. And there are over 25 million hectares, that have annual grasses as a primary component. Our ability to be able to protect the sagebrush plant communities requires a few things. First of all, our ability to assess different control techniques for different scales of invasion and different plant community types that we choose to work in. So we must be able to match the scale of the annual grass problem with some tactics for control and solution. The three most common herbicides used for annual grass control in rangelands are imazapyc, rimsulfuron, and glyphosate, which are all three post-emergent herbicide, and they are able to provide around 1 year of control. And after that 1 year, reapplication is required or some integration with another management technique, such as targeted grazing or using prescribed fire to control annual grasses. However, it's very important that we are able to maintain annual grass control for a period of time in which depletes the annual grass seed bank, and it wouldn't be able to bounce back as soon as control is released. An experiment by Sebastian et al. In Colorado, where they took soil cores in dense cheatgrass area, revealed that 4 to 5 years of continuous control, in this case they used glyphosate, was required until cheatgrass stopped emerging from the soil seed bank. So that tells us we need consistent control year after year until we can deplete the soil seed bank and allow maybe the plant community to control the annual grass itself further on. The herbicide that this study includes and talks about is indaziflam, which trade name is Rejuvera. It's produced by Bayer. It's a broad spectrum pre-emergent herbicide which inhibits the cellulose biosynthase and targets emerging seedlings in relatively shallow root layer. It has a long soil residual up to around 3 years, depending on the moisture level of the site, which is longer than the other three herbicides I just mentioned that are currently used in range. Indaziflam was labeled for use in natural areas in 2016 and then was approved for use in grazed areas at a certain rate in 2020. Numerous studies have revealed that indaziflam has been able to control annual grasses for at least 3 years, but this is a pretty new herbicide and there's a lot of testing still going on in different trials. So most of the previous trials have not occurred in high sagebrush cover like my study will take place in. Okay, so my main study question for this chapter or this presentation will be, how do native plant communities and invasive annual grasses respond to an indaziflam application? And to tackle that question, I'll be using three main objectives. The first of which is to assess annual grass control. The next is to compare plant community response by treatment. And then the third is to classify plant community resilience and tie into that, the big questions I mentioned at the beginning. My study takes place at Wrinkler Rock Creek Ranch, like Tim mentioned. It's a university-owned ranch in conjunction with the local land trust and the Nature Conservancy. It's near Haley, Idaho, in southern Idaho, and is around 11,000 acres of actively managed land, and it also includes another 11,000 acres of surrounding BLM grazing allotments. There's the active research site for a lot of range ecology research. The study area was treated with indaziflam in September of 2020 using a helicopter at a rate of 5 ounces per acre. It's important to note that this rate of 5 ounces per acre is also the rate at which grazing is allowed. That, like I mentioned earlier, was just approved in 2020 with this herbicide. We used 5 gallons of water per acre and treated a total of 48 acres within 3 pastures. So the first pasture I'll talk about is in yellow on the map, and there was about an 8-acre block, which is indicated, the treated area is indicated with the red X. And then within the red box, we can see a very skinny 5-acre strip, and then a relatively large 35-acre treated section. And the boxes next door to the treated areas represent our untreated control comparison sections, and those untreated areas were delineated based on an area that would have an equal representation of the aspects and slopes represented within the treated areas to try and assess those plant communities. We located our permanent assessment plots within both treated and untreated areas by stratifying based on shrub and perennial grass and forb cover. We were able to gather rangeland plant functional group cover from the Rangeland Analysis platform, which estimates plant functional group cover every year from 1984 to 2020 based on Landsat imagery and is ground truthed with over 60,000 ongoing monitoring plots in the West. So I was interested in delineating shrub cover at high versus low at a 25% cover, and then perennial grass and forb cover was delineated at 30% cover. And just keep these delineations in mind as I'll be talking about my analysis in reference to these different plant community types. And just to zoom in a little bit closer to Southern Idaho and the ranch, you can see the 4 plant community types which are represented within the ranch, and the red X's are my study areas. So I'm gonna just quickly go through some photos of these different plant community types to give you guys some context for what my study site looks like. I do have photos of both control and treated areas, but I'd like you to just focus on the big picture of how this site looks and not necessarily look for differences by treatment, as we will discuss that in a little bit. So these are some high shrub, high perennial forb and grass plots. These are high shrub and low perennial cover, characterized by usually very high sagebrush cover. These are some low shrub, high perennial, which sometimes was dominated by low sage, other times was just mostly perennial bunch grasses. And these are some low shrub, low perennial grass plots, which is definitely the most rare within my study area because there is simply a lot of sagebrush in my study area. So we're kind of limited in areas that had low shrub and low perennial cover. We sampled plant communities using a modified sage step monitoring protocol, which uses 30 by 30 meter permanent assessment plots and samples vegetation cover on parallel transects within those plots. We used 3 30-meter transects where we assessed plant cover using a line point intercept technique, which requires you to walk along the transect and drop a pin at a frequency. In our case, we used every half meter, and record any plant that touches the pin. And then you count the number of times you hit a certain plant per transect to calculate cover. And we also measured some other ecosystem attributes related to fuels characteristics for modeling fire behavior, but for now, I'm just going to talk about plant community cover. Okay, so into our first objective about assessing annual grass control. So this figure shows annual grass percent cover, which is a combination of cheatgrass and Japanese brome cover within our 4 plant community types by control in teal and treatment in orange. And statistical significance is indicated by the capital letters in the bars using an ANOVA with alpha 0.05. So first off, we can see that there was relatively low annual grass cover at this site. Most of the areas had under 20% annual grass cover. You can also see that within 3 out of the 4 plant community types, there were no significant differences caused by treatment in reduction of annual grass cover for this first year. We do see that within low shrub and low perennial community types, there was a significant reduction in annual grass cover by treatment, and that the low shrub, low perennial plant community type overall had significantly higher annual grass cover than the other 3 plant community types. Okay. If we look at percent annual grass control by, once again, the different plant communities, treatment classifications, and also shown is the average annual grass cover, we see between 49 and 63% annual grass control, which is lower than has been observed in other studies using the same herbicide. However, it's worth noting that the annual grass cover in our site was relatively low. So when we see a reduction from 4 to 2% average cover, it is a 63% control rate, but we started with a pretty low annual grass cover in some of these areas. Also, in low shrub, low perennial plots, we reduced annual grass cover from 29 to 15%, which was the lowest percent control, but the greatest reduction in percent cover of annual grasses. Okay, on to our next objective, which was to compare plant community response within plant community types. So in this figure, you can see species richness, which is the count of the number of species present by plant functional group, which are the color codes. So there's annual forbs, perennial grasses and shrubs within treated and untreated areas, and the different panels represent the different plant community types. And once again, the statistical significance is indicated with the letters and bars. So the first thing we can observe here is that treatment did not significantly alter species richness in any of the plant community types. However, there were some differences within the plant community types by species richness. So high shrub, low perennial, and low shrub, high perennial plots had significantly higher total species richness than did the other 2. You also look at the same setup but by percent cover, and this is including annual grasses in the percent cover. They're shown in dark blue. So for this, we see that the only significant alteration within treatment groups was in the high shrub, low perennial plant community type, where treatment significantly increased. There was significantly higher percent cover within the treated area. And after that, we see that the high shrub plant community types had significantly higher percent cover than the low shrub. And this is mostly due to the increased pink box that you can see, which is increased shrub cover. So that makes sense since we delineated them based on their shrub cover. We were lucky enough to get to sample within very diverse native plant communities, and we observed over 75 native plant species within both treated and untreated areas. Here are some pictures of just a few. We also observed numerous perennial grass species within both treated and untreated areas, but people for some reason don't like perennial grass about as much as they like flowers. So here are some pretty flowers instead. Right, and then moving on to the last objective, which was to classify plant communities based on their traits to quantify resilience. So I quantified ecosystem resiliency using techniques outlined by Wainwright et al. In their paper, which classifies sagebrush plant community types. I calculated this based on a shrub index and a herbaceous invadedness index. The shrub index is the total shrub cover divided by the total cover, and the herbaceous invadedness index is the cover of herbaceous invasive plants over the total cover. And then you can plot you can visualize your plots along the 2 axes of shrub and invasive indices. In the figure on the right, the dots represent different plant communities. Based on Wainwright et al., we would expect the highest resilience plant communities would have a relatively high shrub index, but a relatively low invasive index. And you can see that is met with both of the high shrub plant community types. They're relatively high shrub and pretty low invasive. We can also visualize similarity within the different plant community types using a 95% confidence interval ellipses as shown here. So for this, we can observe that both of the high shrub plant community types were more highly overlapping with each other than were the low shrub. And within low shrub, there does seem to be a difference based on perennial cover. You can see that the purple points are more spread out and have higher invasive index values. So in summary, we did see a reduction in annual grass cover, but the control level was variable with the different plant community types and was lower compared to other studies using Indaziflam. We did not observe a difference in species richness by treatment, but instead observed differences by plant community type. We observed very diverse native plant communities within both treated and untreated areas, and saw that the high shrub plant community types were the most similar to each other. These data could be useful for many reasons, but some of the potential implications could be assessing options for annual grass control in mesic sagebrush plant communities, which are the higher elevation, higher productivity. These are of high value for wildlife habitat and forage quality, so is valuable information to gain from these high productivity sagebrush plant communities. Additionally, since we had such a diverse native plant community, we will be able to develop a species list of those species which were tolerant to Indaziflam and still present in treated areas. So moving forward, we will continue to analyze a little bit more of the data related to the fuels, so the amount of fuel for potential wildfire and also how continuous that fuel bed is. We will be modeling fire behavior and potential fire effects. And next summer, we will be resurveying the plant communities to assess control 2 years after treatment. So I would like to thank a lot of people, and I feel very lucky to, first of all, get to work with the ranch and have my study here and get to work with all these great people. So my advisors, my committee, the lab members, and a bunch of excellent technicians that helped collect all this data. And with that, I would be happy to take some questions or chat more about my study.
Thank you, Georgia. That's a very nice presentation. So any questions for Ritika and Georgia?
Hi, Georgia. I have a question. So what happens, or maybe this is, too far along because this is like very early in your study, but what happens to the land once it has been released from control? Do you know if it just gets like reinvaded, or does the control last?
Yep, so I think it depends on the control efficacy of how effective the control was in the first place. And also it depends on the native plant communities that are present. And so at a lot of sites on the ranch, we have diverse perennial grasses and other perennial forbs that once annual grasses are removed, they're able to fill in those locations and kind of take up that space that would make it less likely to be invaded again in the future. But it could also be impacted by like location, maybe areas closest to roads would be more likely to become reinvaded, things like that. But it's pretty dependent on the native plant community that's present to kind of take up the space.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, so areas along the road being more likely to be reinvaded, is it worth trying to combat the weeds in that area?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it depends on the surrounding plant community and what your management objectives are for the area. But for example, areas next to road could also be a high ignition risk for wildfires. So there may be some other motivations other than trying to reduce spread of the invasive. It could also be to try and reduce ignition risk. Like sparks from cars or something are really more easily caught fire in cheatgrass fuel beds than in others. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Any more questions for both speakers?
I have a quick question for Georgia. Can you just explain how the invasive annual grasses cause the more frequent, higher intensity fires?
So historically in the sagebrush steppe, depending on elevation, the normal fire return interval, which is the time in between a fire, is historically between 50 and like 110, 120 years, pretty long time. But the annual grasses have come in and they are more ignitable, and also they create a more continuous fuel bed. So usually in sagebrush, the plants are pretty patchy and have space, bare ground, in between each plant. So if a fire were to catch, it usually burns in a more mosaic kind of patchy way. But with the cheatgrass being present, which dries out a lot earlier in the season and can be more continuous, so it just connects all those gaps in between plants. If it is able to catch on fire, it's able to spread at a higher rate and burn at a higher intensity because of that connectivity between the fuels. That's another part of that's a different chapter, but yeah. So someone asked, so what concentration of the chemical is it harmful for grazing animals? So it is labeled for use in grazed rangelands at 5 ounces per acre. So you can use that or a lower rate in grazed areas. I don't know of any studies that have assessed actual animal response though.
Oh, we still have 5 minutes, so we can have more questions for both. Well, if not, so thank you for both student speakers today, and we'll have a brief discussion. I mean, brief discussion for the student who registered the class.
Okay, well, thanks to both the presenters.